Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fermented Man, A Year on the Front Lines of a Food Revolution, by Derek Dellinger, narrated by Crisden. Introduction. So you can eat cheese? Standing in my kitchen on January 1st, 2014, I stared at cabinets full of food I wouldn't be able to eat for the entire next year. In the back of the pantry were cans of beans, jars of jam, boxes of pasta, the same staples that haunt most pantries in America. Some of them may have first joined the shadows in the back of my pantry years ago, like the cans of various beans I never knew what to do with. All of them were now off-limits for my diet in their current form. The beans might be worth saving for some wild experiment, at least, and their powers of long-term preservation were worth noting. The pasta I tossed. Everything I ate from that point on, for the duration of 2014, would have to be fermented. With the exception of water, my sustenance would consist 100% of fermented meals and fermented drinks. For the next year, I would make myself the embodiment of the preservational and nutritional power of microbe-made foods, one of the oldest culinary traditions in the world. I would live off the stuff, or at least try, until I overdosed on sauerkraut. A few other containers remained in my lonesome cabinets, some slivers and kernels of various nuts, a bag of sunflower seeds. I wasn't sure if I'd want to eat vintage seeds in a year, but I left them anyway. Maybe, I thought, I could throw them in some kimchi. The spices I left untouched. Spices would help season and preserve those foods I could still eat. The jars and jars of gurgling vegetables lining up on my shelves. Other cabinets and shelves, including most of those inside my fridge, were already well stocked with the many krauts and preserved oddities that would sustain me for my year of fermentation. These jars were far more colorful than the cans I was sorting out and discarding, bubbling, alive, and vibrant with the colors of carrots, peppers, red cabbage, and garlic, which had for some reason turned blue. It was the simple color of an unusual jar of sauerkraut on a grocery store shelf that launched this whole project of mine. Many months earlier, I had been browsing at a natural food market with a small section, a couple of brands, really, of fermented veggies. I liked sour beers and kombucha and poured vinegar and lemon juice in my water sometimes, just for the taste. I enjoyed sour flavors, but the diversity of fermented foods out there had never really occurred to me before. Lately, I'd been cooking a lot of braised red cabbage, which gets a pungent, tangy character as it slowly simmers in its juices and a generous amount of vinegar. And on the grocery store shelf was this jar of red cabbage sauerkraut that dared to be a little different. Though not so fundamentally strange, after a moment's thought, why not make kraut out of a different type of cabbage? It seemed like this jar might contain an array of flavors I would doubtlessly enjoy, arranged in ways I had never experienced before. And unlike almost any other food I'd ever seen, this jar was so very proud to assure me that it contained still living microbes. We are so afraid of mysterious germs, of microbes we don't understand, and here this weird sauerkraut was boasting of their presence. I had to try it out. At best, I figured it would just taste much like the braised red cabbage I already made. At worst, it would be another forgotten curiosity in my fridge. I'm a collector of condiments, of any novel flavor I stumble across, though half of them go unused. I'm always game for something new. In the back of my mind, before I even opened the jar, everything was starting to connect. The same bacteria in some of the sour beers I brewed at home was in not just yogurt, but also sauerkraut, and kimchi, and cheese. I'd thrown dozens of different ingredients into my experimental home-brewed beers to see how these new elements would affect the flavor of the liquid. But somehow, the urge to take the bacteria out of the liquid and dump it into other ingredients themselves, fermenting them exclusively, hadn't really occurred to me. The possibilities were fascinating. And endless. If sauerkraut could be so diverse, and just about any vegetable could be fermented, and there were all these fermented meats and dairy products out there, well, you could almost live off this stuff, I thought. I tried the red cabbage kraut the night I bought it. It wasn't just the best sauerkraut I'd ever had. It was unlike anything I had ever tasted before. I was hooked. From my struggles to find a fermented meal while on vacation in New Orleans, to sampling mucousy green century eggs in Chinatown, to my quest to visit Iceland and consume the rotten shark meat that remains a national delicacy, I've found that the world of fermented food is fascinatingly complex and endlessly flavorful. And while most of us may never wish to consume the really extreme examples of fermentation, the ultimate significance of learning about the microbes that make our food goes much deeper. As if creating new and exciting flavors from cabbage and dead sharks isn't enough, fermentation also unlocks all sorts of nutrients, makes foods easier to digest, destroys pathogens and toxins, and sends probiotic reinforcements to restore balance to our microbiome, the unique ecosystem of symbiotic microbes inside us. At first, I didn't come up with the idea of an all-fermented diet intending to actually go through with it. It started merely as a thought experiment that I couldn't get my mind off of. With research, it evolved from a thought experiment into a real-world challenge. An extreme yet temporary diet. A hard year, January to January. I felt that it would be fascinating for someone to examine the culinary world in this particular light, something that possibly no one had ever done before, but which should be perfectly possible, if the supposed health-endowing benefits of fermented foods I kept hearing about were true. I wasn't attempting to address a specific medical issue, but for years I had been questioning much about the general America diet and floundering when it came to understanding what we were supposed to be eating and how we were supposed to be eating it. More and more I read about the importance of the microbes that coexist within us and the ways they shape our biological destiny. Our microbiome may steer our health from a young age, determining our allergies and ailments, even having an uncanny bearing on our mental health, food cravings, and weight. The human microbiome is one of the hottest areas of contemporary research. After decades of sterilizing every surface there is to be sterilized, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if you really did live off of food thriving with bacteria, ingested microbes into your body on a daily basis? Would you become sick eventually? Would you become healthier, immune to illness? After all, the probiotics I was reading about seemed to claim a solution for just about anything that might ail us. First, we were taught to fear bacteria, to drown ourselves in hand sanitizer so as to avoid germs. Now we're supposed to take bacteria in pill form. Something seemed to be missing in the middle of this advice, and someone would have to be stupid enough to consume all the microbes they possibly could to figure out what would happen. Eventually, I realized the person crazy enough to do this was me. After all, I had become obsessed with microbes and the magic they're capable of, and I wanted to see what all they could do. The humbling range of foods they could transform into something palatable and preserved for humans. After a few obsessive years of home-brewing beer, cider, and kombucha, I was fully enamored of fermentation and the myriad transformational possibilities it represented. One thing led to the next, and the more I dabbled in pouring sugary liquid into buckets to let them gurgle, or packing veggies into jars to let them break down, the more it seemed this infinitely vast culinary world was barely explored in the contemporary American meal. I was fascinated by how widespread the tradition of fermented foods is and how overlooked the connection between them is today. How many people would realize that the yogurt they had for breakfast, the hazy yellow Goza-style beer they drank at the craft beer bar, and the pepperoni on that slice of pizza they were craving at 2 a.m. as they stumbled home from said bar, are all made by the same species of bacteria? My diet would invite questions. Wait, how can you live off of that? And, okay, so what is fermented food? I've had some version of this conversation dozens of times. Everyone's base of knowledge on the subject is a little different, of course, but it's interesting that there seems to be no single food universally recognized as fermented by the general American public. Alcohol squeaks in there, but many of us have never considered that the same process goes beyond booze. After someone learns about my Fermented Man project for the first time, the initial response is usually a few seconds of silence. Or they'll ask me why I'd undertake such a diet, and I'll explain. But then they're forced to brainstorm. There may as well be a cartoon thought bubble hovering over their head, a flickering light bulb next to a sketch of a bottle of beer, and then blank. 5 or 10 seconds pass. Then most people will say, "Oh, so you can eat cheese?" After cheese, I often have to explain that yes, bread counts because the rising power of yeast is a process of fermentation. But once someone has grasped that the subtitle of my book could be "A Year of Grilled Cheese," Most have accepted that the project, while still insane, isn't as likely to starve me as they might have first imagined. At this point, I'll list off a few more well-known fermented foods. Bread and cheese aren't the whole of the story. There are non-alcoholic liquids like vinegar, kombucha, and kefir. There's yogurt. Everyone knows yogurt, even if they don't know how it's made. Kimchi. Sauerkraut is perhaps the most obvious, but one people often forget. We rarely encounter the production behind most of these foods. Or maybe the makers of these things use other, more sophisticated-sounding words to describe what's happening. Cultured sounds classy and vague enough not to scare anyone away. The process of fermentation spans an incredibly vast web of foods and cultural traditions, but unless you're into fermentation as a hobby, you probably haven't connected most of these. You've probably never wondered what exactly happens when prosciutto sits around for 2 years. It wasn't so long ago that I had my own mostly empty thought bubble, holding a jar of lacto-fermented sauerkraut and wondering what else could be transformed by this same process. It turns out, if you really dive into this fermentation business, the possibilities are nearly limitless. In fact, you could fill a book with it all. The Fermented Man is not about trying to convince anyone else to eat only fermented foods. If I can lead by example in taking the extreme road, I want to drive home the importance of eating at least some fermented food and being aware of what that means. By doing this myself for a whole year, I hope to demonstrate that it's not that intimidating. It's actually pretty simple and delicious. What makes something a fermented food? There are textbook definitions. There are simplified answers to this, and I'll explore them all. But they are mostly simple answers that do little to really explain what is a very complex subject. You could write an entire guidebook on DIY fermentation. You could write many, many books about each individual fermented product. Not just fermenting vegetables, but cabbage specifically. Not just fermenting cabbage, but one regional variant, kimchi, specifically. Every culture in the world has developed its own traditions of fermented foods, and they encompass just about anything you can imagine, from tangy, flavorful condiments to preserved rotten fish to tangy condiments made out of rotten fish. You don't have to grasp every complexity of every fermentation process to appreciate why it's significant. But if you are daunted by even the fuzzy philosophical explanations of the basic concept, don't worry. Think of it this way. If there were some sort of invisible quasi-magical force at the secret heart of the world, operating on everything at all times, it probably wouldn't be all that easy to understand, would it? But you'd want to at least acknowledge it and to be aware of its significance for your everyday life. For many years, it never really occurred to me that fermentation existed outside of alcoholic beverages, and bread, which is essentially just the solid form of beer. Let alone that it produced, say, salami. Salami making, after all, will rarely seem as dynamic as the fermentation of a liquid beverage like beer, where the explosive growth of yeast and their subsequent feeding frenzy creates a stunning, highly visual display. Many a homebrewer has stayed up all night anxiously watching as a more vigorous than expected fermentation foams over the jug that was supposed to contain it, oozing sticky syrup onto the floor. Humans watching a beverage ferment can tell instinctually that some powerful force is at work, even if they don't quite understand what is happening or how. Thinking about wheels of cheese aging in caves, a skin of bacteria and mold accumulating on their milky flesh, it's easy to overlook the common thread. I would guess that the majority of fermenters start with a beverage of some sort. Beer, cider, wine, and kombucha are all quite fun and engaging to make. In most cases, and probably in most minds, fermentation could be crudely summarized as when yeast and/or bacteria make bubbles. In most alcoholic ferments, yeast consume a sugary liquid and produces booze and CO2. The CO2, of course, makes bubbles. Such fermentations are lively and active and easy to follow along with. But without an easy visual cue, how does one know if a food is fermented? And what does that ultimately mean? If one were to live off of only fermented food for an entire year to become a human metaphor, where would one draw the line between food that's fermented by microbes or just rotten? Is there even a line? In the broadest sense, fermentation is what happens when we let microbes run wild with our food. transforming it through metabolic processes, essentially eating some of the food before you do and leaving behind the gift of little microbial miracles like alcohol, CO2, and tart lactic acid. To quote Sandor Katz, a fermentation guru who has penned some of the most thorough and influential books on the subject, fermentation is everywhere, always. It is an everyday miracle, the path of least resistance. It's a truly fascinating way of looking at what happens to the little bundles of calories we call food. What happens to food over time? Something is going to start eating it, and as humans, we have the rare opportunity to guide that process and use it to our benefit. The inevitable path is also the easiest. Almost all food will ultimately be consumed by some group of microbes, which in most circumstances we think of as rot. Fermentation is preservation by select microbes. The distinction is very often blurred, as it's essentially the same process. What matters is which microbes you cede control of your food to and what they do with it. It's an embrace of the invisible forces around us, forces our industries have been trying to hide from us for decades, removing the unpredictability of wild fermentation in exchange for neat, clean factory production. But there's no hiding the importance of microbes entirely, and waking up to realize how much they shape the world is jolting. If we step away, deny the opportunity to ally with friendly microbes, the warring invisible forces have a free-for-all. Entropy reigns and food decomposes in the resulting frenzy. But with our help, one force wins out over the other, musters behind its ramparts, and an environment is created that allows these friendly, naturally occurring bacteria and yeast to win, to our benefit. Fermentation is easy. We simply let the inevitable happen, but with just enough steering to produce delicious, healthy results. As it turns out, the implications of this are far more important than just what kind of food you keep in the jars stocking your shelves. We've spent great amounts of energy in the last century learning how to preserve food with chemicals and temperature. More recently, we seem to be entrenched in a long, expansive campaign to smother the entire world in antibiotics, presumably for our health. We aim to be indestructible, and we prefer our food the same way. But for most of the history of mankind, we've already had an easy, reliable technology that preserves through the cultivation of bacteria, rather than their elimination. We've been trained to fear the tiny crawly things we can't see, but so many of them are more than just our friends. They have been with us for so long that they have evolved a symbiotic relationship with us, and are likely vital for our health. I hope the daunting and difficult nature of my Fermented Man diet is enough to grab your attention, because the why is far more important than the what as far as our embrace of microbes is concerned. Were fermentation just an academic curiosity, a fun hobby for the tinkerers out there, both the what and the why would bow to the simple how. You may have already decided that you're never going to spend a Tuesday night slicing up 10 pounds of cabbage and cramming it into jars as sea salt crystals skitter across your kitchen table. That's okay. Fermentation doesn't even have to be DIY. It's more important than just a hobby, as great a hobby as it is. Understanding and acceptance is the real endgame here. Reintroducing old cultures in new ways. Finding fermentation in restaurants, on store shelves, and especially in your fridge and cellars and cabinets. It should be made by hand, but it doesn't necessarily have to be your hand. Fermented foods are not new and are not a fad. They are not a miracle cure-all, nor really a diet. While it would probably be far more likely to earn me a lucrative guest appearance on the Dr. Oz show, I am not advocating that anyone else follow my Fermented Man diet exclusively. I want to be upfront. I'm not trying to make the only fermented diet into a thing. Consider this an experiment more than a recommendation. My primary hope for this book is that it sparks your interest, educates you, and helps you to figure out how to incorporate these foods into your own diet and daily rhythms. It often seems that contemporary Western stomachs are being fought over by powerful forces of competing marketing dollars. Be it the forces of industrial food producers and their plastic-wrapped parodies of sustenance, or the countless cleverly marketed programs claiming to help free you from the fattening foods of those same industrial food producers, the only reliable constant seems to be the fact that no one knows how or what to eat for sure. While the aim of this book is not to solve the mystery of the modern diet, though if you happen to feel that it does, please don't hesitate to share these thoughts with, say, Oprah. We will certainly touch on such subjects, as fermented foods are closely tied to issues of health and culture. However trendy fermented foods may become, and in modern culture it often seems that we have only fads and fears, they are something that has always been with us, or almost always. Their near extinction in American mainstream culture seemed entirely possible until very recently. For a couple of decades, cheese and beer and bread seemed doomed to be locked into their new homogenized forms thanks to the heavy stamp of industrialization, reimagined as crude, bland imitations of the life-sustaining goods our ancestors enjoyed. Yogurt had not yet become a billion-dollar industry, and a grocery store staple worthy of an entire section near the milk. Sauerkraut, turned soggy and bland, was mostly just a novelty condiment to be scraped off of hot dogs at baseball games and county fairs. The forces of industrialization are at work all across the globe, of course. While no one is immune, Americans seem to be particularly enamored of modernization, even hungry for it. With no deep-seated history of culinary tradition to unite us, we're easily distracted by novelties and food fads. We lack the pride for a national dish with a long historical tie to health. Apple pie and hot dogs don't count. One might even make the case that industrialization itself has become the great American culinary tradition, as we have come to value consistency and predictability in our dining experience above all else. And why not? If fermented foods were lost so easily, what else could their reappearance be but another nostalgic trend? We have no trouble preserving food with modern methods now. So, for what possible reason would we willingly choose to consume bacteria? While I will say again that eating fermented foods is not a miracle cure-all or a secret dieting trick, there are vital lessons of health to be gleaned from learning about these traditional foods. There are broad-reaching, more insidious lessons to be learned about how we see the microbial world and how humans now negotiate with these invisible forces. And there is also the issue of flavor. Think of a food product with a strong association to a particular country, and chances are fermentation played some role in making it. Whatever they are, fermented foods are neither bland nor boring. You already associate fermentation with flavor. You just don't know it. Walk into an ice cream shop, and you can guess they will have at least 2 varieties. Really, the most basic, popular flavors you can think of for just about anything, ice cream or otherwise. Are we both thinking of chocolate and vanilla right now? Good. No, that ice cream wasn't fermented, though if you're in a frozen yogurt shop, that's a different story. But cocoa beans and vanilla beans both undergo a fermentation process after harvest to develop their flavor. Enjoy waking up in the morning? No, of course you don't. It's the worst. Thank God for coffee, with its rich aroma and bracing complexity. Those beans are also matured through fermentation. Where would the world be without coffee, chocolate, and vanilla? It would be absolute chaos out there. Fermentation can take bland vegetables and make them mouth-wateringly dynamic in flavor. They can also take weird-smelling vegetables and make them far more weird-smelling in very different ways. Fermentation touches nearly every condiment you have ever used, as most are simply blends of vinegar, fermented, and spices. Plenty of others take the fermentation all the way. It is only from our current dismal position, seated atop decades' worth of indestructible industrial food products, that fermented foods could seem such an obscure novelty, a hot new culinary trend. In cultures across the globe, or moving back through history, fermented foods are more than flavor enhancers or possible health supplements. They are indispensable staples, combating forces of rot and entropy, a means of unlocking nutrients, increasing portability, eliminating poisons, and making those foods we value even more valuable. There is no question for most that a small hunk of artisanal cave-aged cheese is worth more than a liter of milk. That salty, savory slices of prosciutto from Italy should command more desire than mere cubes of cooked ham. Or that a sack of raw barley pales in comparison to the desirability of a bottle of barrel-aged imperial stout. Throughout history, These distinctions, the desire to consume the aged and microbe-influenced over the raw and fresh, divided more than shelves in the grocery stores. They have divided classes and kingdoms. Whether for preservation or flavor or status, humans have relied on fermentation for their most precious dishes for almost all of history. The greatest magic of fermentation, though, is how wonderfully easy it is to perform. With most ferments, the tools required hardly go beyond the raw ingredients. Remember, we are tapping into a natural force. Recipes are less important than a basic understanding of the process, which we'll cover here. Whatever else you may get from this book, I encourage everyone to try fermentation of some sort at least a few times. Find a night to work it into your routine, to learn its rhythms. Explain it to your friends. Normalize the relationship with microbes that began at the dawn of our species. After finishing your first batch of fermented veggies, you may, like me, wonder how something so simple could ever be forgotten. Many fruit wines and ciders could be made with about 5 minutes of preparation using supplies readily available from any grocery store in the world. And unpasteurized or UV-treated apple cider from the farmer's market will simply start fermenting on its own if you fail to drink it quickly enough. Beer making requires more steps, but is all the more rewarding and creative for its complexity. Home brew shops are widespread, and assistance is plentiful. In recent decades, home brewers have been at the forefront of the home fermentation movement, or at least they're the most visible proponents, due to the surge in craft beer popularity in America. This sudden interest in all types of fermentation is wonderful news for everyone. When I think about the pervasive mystery of fermentation, the general misunderstanding about how this ancient craft actually works and what it means, I realize that only the art of it has been lost. The knowledge behind it was never very well distributed in the first place. It's no wonder that most of us never tie beer, cheese, and pickles together. Humanity has been summoning these forces for thousands of years without understanding what, exactly, was happening. Sadly, the very knowledge that allowed us to observe and understand the microbes at work all around us also gave us the opportunity, for the first time in history, to fear them and wage war on them. We've seized that opportunity with an unfortunate fervor and quickly ushered in a world where ubiquitous lager beer is a commodity that originates from massive factories. Bread comes from a bag, and yogurt and sauerkraut and all the rest, well, we didn't have to envision how those were made at all. There's no need to ever see the process. We just have to navigate to the right section of the grocery store. But for most of our history, a jug of some beverage fermenting in a cellar and a crock full of kraut weighted by rocks, releasing gurgling bubbles of carbon dioxide, would have as commonplace as grilling meat in the backyard. A rolling fermentation at its peak leaves a powerful impression. It is plainly obvious that something potent is developing within, under the surface. Touch the sides of the vessel and it will feel mostly cool to the touch, yet the frothing turmoil capping the liquid looks just like a pot of soup simmering, if not more violent. Yeast collects in a thick, creamy head, bubbles dance in fast-moving currents. Foam sluices over the lid of a too small container. Sniff at the surface and a vicious layer of CO2 will bite back, burning your nostrils and leaving you lightheaded. A fermentation can look exactly as if it is boiling, an observation that has been made for so long that to boil, in Latin, is the very root of the word ferment. Touch it, and this silent cold boil will not burn you, though it has many other powers that are equally potent. It is probably no coincidence that the two most powerful and pervasive forces we have to prepare food, the hot flame and the cold boil, are also likely mankind's earliest and most significant discoveries. Each has been theorized to be the first form of technology, but to call them technology seems somewhat off when they exist independently in the world around us. We only learned to steer them, and even that's been dicey work. Poorly harnessed or not, both forces have mesmerized humans for all of history. Both surround us still in small ways, but for most of us, for most of our lives, we now know these forces only through the fear of their dark sides. We believe our food will soon rot without refrigeration, without some way to artificially preserve it, some miracle of human technology with powers beyond the root cellar in the basement. Would we have food available to us at all? Our love of abundance has eroded our appreciation for the simple, stable foods that have sustained human.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?